This is the first full-scale biography of Julian Assange, and it's also the first full-scale account of the whole WikiLeaks phenomenon, which has been the most extraordinary thing. WikiLeaks and Julian, they've burst from being a sort of shadowy group of hackers, a sort of niche player in the world, into being global celebrities. And Assange has been turned into a highly controversial rock star, if you like. So this is the first time that this whole story has been put together, and it really does read like a sort of white-knuckle ride.
This was one of the biggest stories of the last 10 years, I suppose. It was a story that was being discussed in the Kremlin, in the White House, and in China and India and South America simultaneously. And it's a gripping story. It's a gripping story of a man on the run with the biggest leak in history, and how he conspired with 5 news organizations to get that story out.
Well, the book opens with this rather wonderful scene of Julian dressing up as an old woman, and basically with a wig and even a hunchback. This really happened 2 weeks before the launch of the State Department cables in November. Julian decided that where he was staying at the Frontline Club was too dangerous, and so he and a couple of nerdy acolytes kind of fled in a battered car, with Julian disguised as an old woman, going up towards Cambridgeshire and then Norfolk, and then darting into laybys every so often and cutting the lights to see whether the Pentagon were on the trail. It turned out that they weren't, but I think that's very, very interesting and says a lot actually about his childhood growing up in Australia.
He had the most extraordinary background. His family, they ran a touring puppet theatre, and he became so disturbed and disrupted that the computer became his only friend. So it's a story about a brilliant, gifted boy who became a sort of pioneer in the internet age. Some people say a messiah, some people say a terrorist, some people say a maniac.
He's such an extreme figure that he absolutely polarizes people. So there are people who project on him and want to believe he's the messiah, and then there are some people who want to believe he's the devil. If you take a more nuanced view, it's easy to argue either of those cases, but if you say, well, he's neither the messiah nor the devil, that can sometimes place you in an uncomfortable position in the middle. And there was people who didn't want to believe anything bad of him and people who didn't want to believe anything good of him.
When Julian came into our lives in London, it was extraordinary. He blew in like one of the lost boys out of Peter Pan. He just had a backpack with a big computer in it and the clothes he stood up in and nothing else. And I said, have you got somewhere to stay? And he said, no. So I said, you better stay with me. And I said, have you had anything to eat? And he said, no. So I took him to a restaurant and put the menu in his hand, and he ordered 12 oysters and a piece of cheese. And then he came to my house and he stayed up all night tapping at his laptop, and about 5 o'clock in the morning suddenly keeled over and fell asleep and just sort of crashed out with his leather jacket buttoned up to the neck. So that's the kind of weird nomadic lifestyle he had, and it made him quite difficult for ordinary humans to adjust to.
This isn't just a book about Julian Assange, it's actually a book as much about WikiLeaks and about this extraordinary collaboration between WikiLeaks and the Guardian and 4 other international newspapers, including the New York Times. Because let's face it, what we're talking about here is we're talking about the biggest leak in history. We're talking about 250,000 secret documents, classified State Department communiques, which have now been spilled into the outside world.
There was a huge row around November 1st, shortly before we published the diplomatic cables, and we tell the full story of that for the first time, in which Julian burst in with his lawyer, basically, and threatened to sue the pants office. He was furious because we had given this material to the New York Times, who were supposed to be our partners, and he'd fallen out with the New York Times because they'd written a profile of him that he didn't like. It was pretty rude about him, that's true. And we ended up having hours and hours of argument, and we were trying to explain to Julian that we simply had to go ahead with the deal as it was, and we couldn't just throw our toys out the pram at this stage in the game. And eventually he calmed down, and eventually we came to an agreement, and we all parted friends, and a month later we did put out the cables, more or less successfully, in one of the most extraordinary leaks in journalistic history.